former President Donald Trump emerges as the 47th President of the United States of America, defeating Vice President Kamala Harris. During his victory speech, the president-elect boasted of the country's vast reserves of oil and natural gas. Mr. Trump had before now spoken of his plans to increase oil production, saying he would use emergency powers to push through new oil drilling, refinery construction, new power plants, and other projects to ease output. Joining me now on the show to look at Donald Trump's presidency and the politics of global oil markets is energy analyst and lawyer Ayodele Oni. Thank you so much for joining us at this point to look into all of this. Let's first of all look at what Donald Trump, how his economic policies affected outputs when he was the 45th president. Now, how did Donald Trump's economic policies, particularly those related to the oil industry, affect the U.S. economy during his presidency?
Okay, thank you very much for having me. I recall that it appeared quite prosperous at the time he was initially president. I recall that we had a lot around drilling, even coal mining. There were conversations around coal mining and coal mining sites that had been shut. There was a reopening. And I think economically there was some prosperity during his first tenure. Some of it not entirely his own doing, because I think that the world it moves in a cycle. It's boom and bust generally, whether it's globalization or nationalism. It's a cycle. So I think that he's someone who wants to ensure that there's sufficient energy. He wants to make sure that the U.S. can compete. I mean, in some cases, shale definitely is more expensive. So it also have to be a function of what the pricing is. So I think generally for energy is less energy transition, but I'm wondering what it would then now be with his alliance with Elon Musk, for example.
Yes, of course. Talking about his alliance with Elon Musk, how do you think this will shape the business environment in the United States?
Well, I think personally, when it comes to Musk, he's very he's not someone who appears to believe so much in energy transition to start with. I think I mean, I don't know if there will be any refrain to drill, baby, drill. If someone want to open up the federal lands, water, you probably want to ease the regulatory hurdles to oil exploration. And interestingly, he may want to remove the pause on LNG development which President Biden had initially put in place. Now, with respect to Elon Musk, I expect that he would more around giving him contracts he already does have a number of contracts anyways in the United States. I expect that around his electric vehicles, he said he would levy more tariffs on electric vehicles, items coming from outside of the U.S., coming from China and coming from elsewhere. I think that's one area where you'd benefit. You'll probably get certain other fiscal benefits, which everybody else too will get. So I think more around ensuring that what's produced in the U.S. is cheaper through tariffs and other means, and maybe also fiscal incentives. It's cheaper than what you find, what is being imported into the country. And that's where people like Elon Musk may see an advantage, and a number of other manufacturers, business people who are productive and who may be creative. That's what I suspect will be the case more or less for himself. Electric vehicles, so that whatever is coming from outside of the country will be more expensive. That's a key advantage I see anyway.
Yes, a lot of advantages there. But looking at during his 45th presidency, right, he sort of slammed some sanctions on Iran and Venezuela at a point, and these are key to oil production. How did this affect? How did these sanctions affect Iran and Venezuela on the global stage? How did these sanctions impact on the global oil market so far?
Okay, the interesting thing around oil and gas, generally, once you have oil sanctions in place, prices tend to go up.
Yeah.
In fact, once there are rumors of sanctions, particularly for oil producing countries, you would always have the effect. And I dare say some of the substantial part of the inflation we've seen more recently in almost every part of the world is a function of the Ukraine-Russia war and some of these sanctions. Because once demand gets stifled or contracts, once supply contracts, then prices go up. It's market forces of demand and supply, generally speaking. It's more so for oil, So once you hear that there's some dispute, even I suspect that if Israel and Iran should go into war, it's going to make things even worse. So those always lead to an increase in oil prices once you have sanctions, even rumors of war, rumors of sanctions, because the international oil market is very information sensitive, right? It's like the stock market. It's very information sensitive. Whether or not that thing then does happen, you already begin to see the effect on oil prices and the general price of items.
So he has always had this America First policy, and his mantra, the mindset that went around with his campaign was making America great again. Looking at all of this and looking at the business climate in the United States, and of course with specific emphasis on oil production, what more can be done to boost oil production in the U.S., especially with the Trump presidency coming in?
Well, like I said to you, it's going to remove the regulatory hurdles. I suspect that it's going to remove the regulatory hurdles. I suspect that it's going to open up federal land, sea to more exploration. The thing, though, is that we may not necessarily immediately see the effect of that. Remember that there's a relatively long lead time between exploration and reaching first oil, right? Also, you query issues around financing. With the reduction in financing for particularly oil, he may then also look towards gas. Recall that President Biden had paused LNG development in the U.S. If my knowledge is accurate, and if I recall very well, and I think he's going to unpause that. Those are things I think he might do, and he may, in some cases, even provide fiscal incentives, similar to what President Tinubu's done recently, particularly for gas. I expect that he's going to do that. Regulatory hurdles are going to come down. He's going to open both the sea, probably even do bid rounds like you had in the UK recently. So I expect that that's what he's going to do. He's someone who I think believes that all sources and means of energy should be made available, and he thinks that the U.S. should compete. U.S. first being his mantra, make America great again, and U.S. first being his mantra. I think that what he's going to try to do is to see how U.S. can be energy sufficient and can also maybe even bring down oil prices. Because if you bring down oil prices, it then means that the general price of items and the CPI, Consumer Price Index, should go down. I think that's it, and that's one reason why the Democrats lost. You see that the economy ranked very high. Democracy ranked very high, higher than abortion, higher than even immigration in many states. So economy, for them, they think the outgoing administration didn't do well for the economy and from a democracy point of view. And that can be looked at from 2 points of view, whether Trump is a threat or whether what the Democrats were doing in terms of the cases they had against him in court. For them, some people think that was a way to prevent him from running again. And for them, that was anti-democracy or anti-democratic, as it were. So I expect that that's what he's going to do from an oil and gas perspective, allow new pipelines to be built, promote more LNG, more gas production,
Okay.
and also crude, in my view.
All right, so Mr. Trump has spoken of his plans to increase oil production, saying he would use emergency powers to push through new oil drilling, refinery construction, new power plants, and other projects to increase output. And you know that once he goes into this, it might affect the oil industry. Do you think it will be positive or negative?
Okay, well, I think it depends on how you look at it. As an oil producer who wants to benefit, it may end up being negative. Negative in the sense that prices may go down.
Okay.
Oil prices may go down. But positive from the side of the average citizen who wants to be able to buy oil prices lower, I recall there was a time prices had risen, I think during his tenure, it had risen to around $70. And he did quite a bit to reduce it to about 50, and there have been periods where he's protested an increase in oil prices. And I think around 2018, it had moved from around 70 to $50 per barrel. So if prices go down, it then means that even at the pump, your petroleum products will be lower, and then we'll be buying less than 1,000 plus that we're buying it at the moment. So for citizens such as you and I, we will smile, we will be happy. But from an income perspective, particularly countries that are mono-economic, like Nigeria, then it might be a challenge, and then we may need to borrow. We may need to borrow more. We may need to borrow more to be able to meet our budgetary, to be able to fund our budget, right? Because, typically for your budget, you'd have a benchmark for crude oil prices. Well, maybe they will take all of this into consideration and what he may have done in the past to set that benchmark. Because I expect that we may also have some deflation rather than inflation worldwide when he does some of what I think he will do around oil prices and around output. If he does that and see what's happening in the Dow Jones, you see the sharp increase you see in the market. I think that it's coming from an economic standpoint will be good for the average American businessman and may impact the world positively from improved production, from reduced costs of production.
Okay, so now let's look at his trade policies of the past now, such as tariffs on imported oil. How did this influence the industry at the time?
Okay, from an economic standpoint, if you he even had issues with Canada, had issues with that North American bloc, NATO, right? So I think that for the world, for parts of the world, it may not necessarily be excellent news, particularly when you look at it versus the US and versus his policy. I mean, I don't think he'll be able to do all of what he said he would do, but I think he will try to do as much as he can. I think it may lead to, and it may also have adverse effects, because you then ask how much does the US produce if you want to make it difficult for people to be able to then also import. But, if you look at what he's done in the past, people seem to have the sense that they were happier, right, economically, generally speaking, when he was president. And I expect that that's what he may repeat around tariffs, around trade and international politics. I think he's more concerned about ensuring that the average American is happy, and he may continue that. How much it succeed is a different conversation, and the impact that would generally have. Because every now and then, when you try to constrain international trade, it then usually goes back to arm the economy. I'm not sure what will happen in the case of the United States.
All right. So at a point, the U.S. withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement, and so many believe that it impacted the output in the oil sector. Do you agree with that?
Well, Of course, I think that the climate issues around climate change are closely related to net zero, reduction of emissions, and the funny thing, a number of oil and gas companies, exploration and production companies, if I recall very well, Shell and Total have pulled back some of their plans to transition, right? So pulling out just means that, we want to do more with hydrocarbons. We want to ensure that we can drill more, we can produce more, we can be more prosperous. Because if you look at it from this perspective, the world needs to spend heavily to be able to quickly transition, right? If the world is not making that spend, and if any crisis in one part of the world means that you will have issues with non-carbons, like what we did see during when the Ukraine-Russia war started and with COVID, people began to go back to coal. People began to go back to even firewood, to open back their nuclear plants. So if the world has not been able to spend, particularly the Western world has not been able to put in as much finances as is required to be able to transition and even fair transition, right? If transition needs to be equitable, right? If it's not equitable, if it's not fair, the countries have the right to pull out, particularly where they consider that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and those other climate negotiations don't pay them. To be completely honest, I've always thought that the way the transition is being effected looks self-serving, particularly for the Western world, in my view. So if anyone from the West thinks that there's still a lot of oil and gas to be utilized in the world to lead prosperity of the citizenry, you can't really blame them. That's the truth. You can't really blame them in my own view.
All right. So is the United States government taking advantage of the vast potentials of oil and natural gas?
Well, in my view, I don't think they have in the past. And you'd have to look at it along party policies. If you look at the Democrats, if you look at what their campaign promises are, if you look at what their policies are around, if someone can put a pause to LNG development, then it gives you a sense of what their views are around their oil and gas, right? Compared to the Republicans, particularly Trump, he's of the view that let's drill, let's be energy sufficient. So I think the US hasn't done enough recently because of the government in power around its oil and gas. And you recall that there was a challenge also at some point with Canada, particularly around some pipelines that passed through Canada and the US. The US, I think, blocked it at that point, right? So I think that those are some of the things that Trump will deal with and ensure that there can be more utilization of oil and gas in Nigeria, in the United States, and similar to what we're trying to do in Nigeria to drive a gas-centric economic growth. Right? We have a lot of gas, much more gas than we do oil, both non-associated and associated gas. So we're driving a gas narrative. I expect that the E2 will be looking to do a combination of hydrocarbons and non-carbon means so that the US can do more and achieve more with its crude. And I always say because of the long lead times for energy projects, we may not necessarily begin to see the results of some of that. It'll take a few years, right? Some will be immediate, but much of it will take a while. So in my view, the US, at least in the last 4 years, hasn't made the most of its hydrocarbons. I think they'll begin to do more now with the Trump presidency.
All right. So, okay. So in terms of oil and natural gas sector, what are your expectations from the Trump presidency once he becomes the president of the United States? What do you think he should do to rev up the oil and gas sector?
Well, I've mentioned some of that without intending to sound like I'm being repetitive. It'll be the same thing anyone else in the world should do if you want people to invest in your country. the average investor looks at the geology, looks at the ability to convert or monetize their investment. They look at the legal and regulatory regime, and from the legal and regulatory regime, they want to be sure there's stability. They want to be sure that they can get fairness from the courts where there are issues, and they want to be sure that they can generally enforce contracts. So this is what I expect that he will do. He'll make it more attractive for people to come and drill and be able to monetize whatever investment they make in their oil and gas industry. Maybe even also ensure that there is some incentives, fiscal incentives, support with financing, because very recently it's been difficult to get financing. I mean, that changed again recently. It's been difficult to get financing for hydrocarbons projects. But with him coming, ensuring that the fiscals are there, guaranteeing, providing some measure of guarantees and stabilization, you see more people wanting to invest, reduce the regulatory hurdles, so that you can encourage more people. Look throughout the value chain from exploration to the midstream and downstream, and encourage more people to participate in those areas, while still keeping your eyes on encouraging people to also go green. So I think those are the things what everyone else will want to do or should do to have investors come and invest in the hydrocarbons sector.
Can countries like Nigeria do to harness its relationship with the U.S., especially when it comes to oil exports?
Oh yeah, so I think for a while we were one of their biggest trading partners when you speak to sub-Saharan Africa now, or when you speak to Africa generally. And I think that we can do much more. And what we need to do, it's international politics. It's understanding how to foster your own interests too, in a manner that the other country believes that they are gaining as much as they can. Things like bilateral investment treaties that be advantageous to us is one thing we can do. I'm not sure we have a bilateral investment treaty with the US. I know we do have I think we do have with the Netherlands. We might have with France, maybe even with Italy. I'm not sure we have a bilateral investment treaty with the US. If we do not have, this is an opportunity to sign such trade agreements, such treaties, to ensure that there can be bilateral trade and there can be benefits both citizens from each country can get. And we have a lot of Nigerians who are also Americans, It's an opportunity to have them come in to business here and bring in some of the technology, because we have a good market here too.
All right.
We particularly for the mass market, it's something you can do for petroleum products. The country is talking about CNG, LPG, gas penetration. If there's a way one can bring in equipment from the US and have bilateral trade arrangements in a way that it's a win-win for both countries, because with the America First mantra, you have to also show that there's some advantage to the US in doing trade and doing business with Nigeria.
All right. Energy analyst and lawyer Ayode Leoni, thank you so much for talking to us on this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.